a joint news conference on the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program. And now, from Minneapolis, the life of Hubert Humphrey is profiled in the C-SPAN series, The Contenders.
Stay right there. Stay right there. You're nuts. Stay right there. Stay right there. You're nuts. Stay right there. Stay right there. You're nuts.
Mr. Chairman, my fellow Americans, my fellow Democrats, I proudly accept the nomination of our party This moment is one of personal pride and gratification, yet one cannot help but reflect the deep sadness that we feel over the troubles and the violence which have erupted regrettably and tragically in the streets of this great city, and for the personal injuries which have occurred.
That's Hubert Humphrey accepting the 1968 Democratic nomination for president at Chicago's Conrad Hilton Hotel, where the Democrats had gathered for their convention in the midst of the Vietnam War, while thousands of angry protesters demonstrated outside. Hubert Humphrey, longtime Minnesota senator and unsuccessful candidate for president in 1968, is the focus of this week's Contenders program. And we're live from Minnesota's History Center. Mick Coet is the documentarian of Hubert Humphrey's life, just finished a documentary last year. We're standing in the middle of an exhibit that the History Center has put on about the tumultuous year of 1968. So to start our discussion about Hubert Humphrey, I want you to set the stage for people. As 68 dawned, this country was in an uproar about the Vietnam War. Set the stage.
Well, the Vietnam War had been running for a long time at that point, probably 15 years. And the Tet Offensive at the end of January really set the stage for the year, because it was obvious to everyone then that the war was not being won. And the North Vietnamese reached all the way to the American embassy in Saigon. President Johnson's approval ratings just plummeted. And McCarthy had been in the race in the fall. Bobby Kennedy was joining the race. And it was just utter chaos at that point. And then, of course, right after President Johnson resigned in the 29th of March, 3 days later, Martin Luther King was assassinated. So the beginning of that first part of the year was a terrible chaos. It
was a year when people who were alive were turning on their radios every morning to wake up, and there seemed to be another huge story every day. We're going to try and tell some of that story in the context of Hubert Humphrey's campaign for president. We'll be here for 2 hours, and as we're here, we'll learn more about the history of the times and the biography of Senator Humphrey. And partway into it, we'll begin taking your telephone calls so you can be part of our discussion here. What's important for young people to understand is that what's different about the wars we fight today and the Vietnam War is the draft. So this was real, in a sense, for American families in a very different way than the professional army we have today. Will you talk about that?
Sure. The draft was really the point at which the protest really started when the draft was instituted, and it really Now people have a choice if people want to enter the military, or if they're against the war, they can stay away. In those days, there was no choice. You either went to Canada or you did something to get out of being drafted, and that's really what caused the protest. Because, and the other part of that is that people weren't even able to vote until they were 21, but they were being drafted at 18, so they couldn't even vote the people out of office that were running the war. So that's probably the biggest difference.
So is it fair to say that every American family had a personal connection to this war in one way or the other?
I would say pretty much, and some had, two. They had someone who went to the war and someone who was against it in the same family. In fact, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, his own kids were against the war, and he had kids stay, anti-war protesters stay at his house. Stay at his house during that. So there was, families were broken over it, much like the Civil War, I guess.
The other thing that people should understand that made this real in a way that hadn't in wars fought earlier was television. Mm-hmm. Television was bringing it into people's living rooms every night. Will you talk about the effect of that?
Well, it was wide open because nobody had really done any kind of television wasn't restricted. It was all brand new, and so nobody in the administration or anyone else had any control over it. So the journalists were just going out there and getting whatever they found, and we don't have that now. It's much more controlled in the battlefield. So we were seeing things in the living room that you wouldn't see now. Actual battle scenes and people being wounded and that kind of thing. And it had a profound effect on the country. And there was another reason why people came out against the war was they started seeing it all the time on TV. And 300 body bags were coming back every week at one point, and they were showing the body bags coming back and the caskets, and it just had a profound effect. It changed the average person's mind.
Now we have to remind people that the war started before Lyndon Johnson's term. You said it had been raging for 15 years, right. Earlier with advisors and later as troops were deployed. So Lyndon Johnson's attitude about the war was what?
Well, I think he was confused about it for a long time, but he did not want to lose it. It was really important to him to win the war, and it colored everything he did. People tried to talk about any kind of a settlement, and he wouldn't do it. He was interested in winning the war. That was his. And once he got into it, he didn't have a lot of options, and that was the one that the only one he wanted. He had no other option. He didn't want to, and that affected when he left office too. He wanted someone to come into office that would continue his war policy and wouldn't end the war and make him a loser, basically.
So Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey became teammates in 1964, following the assassination of Kennedy, when Lyndon Johnson ran in his own right. What was the relationship like, and how was this period for Senator Humphrey?
Well, the intensity in Vietnam started almost at the exact same time that he became vice president. The Tonkin Gulf resolution, the Tonkin Gulf incident in the summer in Vietnam of '64, there was a resolution in Congress that LBJ asked for, and it was passed, and Humphrey signed on to that. He wasn't yet vice president, as did Gene McCarthy and others. And then the convention came later in the summer, and Humphrey became vice president. So he walked into the beginning of Johnson's real involvement with the war. Campaigned all during the fall, and they really never talked about Vietnam in the campaign. The campaign was more about Barry Goldwater being trigger happy and being Humphrey and Johnson were the peace candidates, and Goldwater was the war candidate, basically. And so, but Vietnam really wasn't talked about. They were talking more about nuclear.
In '64.
In '64, yeah, they were talking more about nuclear, annihilation and nuclear war. And so they won by a landslide, 44 or 50 states. And so in the spring, in the early part of the year when they were in office, there was another incident in Pleiku in Vietnam, and Johnson called a cabinet, sort of an ad hoc cabinet and advisor meeting, and he had already decided to bomb North Vietnam in retaliation. And he asked people around the table what they thought of this, and everyone pretty much agreed. But Humphrey said it's not a good idea, and he backed off. And he had written Johnson a memo earlier, before he was vice president, saying we should not get involved, shouldn't send ground troops in, shouldn't bomb. This is not a good idea, both for you politically, for the country. People won't understand it. So he spoke up again at this meeting. Johnson got angry. Humphrey went back and wrote another memo, a long, detailed one, and sent it to him. And at that point, he was completely frozen out of any discussion of Vietnam.
Well, we have our first two video clips in the program to show you. First is 1964. And remember that Lyndon Johnson had been operating without a vice president when he came into office after the Kennedy assassination. So there was a great deal of speculation going into the convention about who his choice would be to run in 1964. Here is a film from the '64 convention as Lyndon Johnson announces his choice for vice president.
As the next vice president of the United States, my close, my long time, my trusted colleague, Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota.
Democrats and most Republicans in the Senate voted for education legislation, but not Senator Goldwater. Most Democrats and most Republicans in the Senate voted to help the United Nations in its peacekeeping functions when it was in financial difficulty, but not Senator Goldwater.
I couldn't help but think at that particular moment how far we'd come, all of the hard work and effort that we'd put in through those many years. This was a great moment in my life.
Mr. Johnson said in his judgment, Mr. Humphrey was the best man to be president in case anything happened to him. No longer is the vice presidency just another job.
Well, that video, we should tell you, and much of the video you're going to see tonight is from Mick Coet's documentary on Hubert Humphrey, The Art of the Possible. I want to thank you for letting us show it to our audience tonight. Lots to follow up there. First of all, the scenes of the energetic Hubert Humphrey addressing the crowd and having the crowd eating out of his hands, and then the cutaway to Lyndon Johnson, who just didn't seem to share the moment. What was happening there?
Well, he didn't like obviously didn't like the spotlight being taken from him, and Humphrey generally believed to be a better public speaker, so he was just a little bit upset about Humphrey taking the show away, I think. But you know, he was that way. That was Lyndon Johnson. That, by the way, the Goldwater, not Senator Goldwater part of that speech, it was written by a number of people. That speech was written by Bill Moyers. He wrote that back and forth, and there was a call and response kind of thing that really kind of caught on. That was an early one of that kind of speech and worked really well.
The call and response.
Yeah. Yeah, not Senator Goldwater, and then they would,
right.
You know, there was crowd to respond.
It was also, Senator Humphrey had ambitions for the presidency for quite a while. He toyed with it in '52, made a real bid in '60, and here he was finally at that convention accepting the vice presidential nomination. You could see how excited he was about the moment. He earned the nickname the Happy Warrior. He loved politics, right? Right.
Oh, absolutely. He loved politics, and he got in trouble later for calling it the politics of joy, which is what he was about. He was joyful about politics, and he believed it was a way to do better in the country, to change the country, and he believed in it in a very innocent and we might think naive way, but it was really an innocent way. He believed in the country, believed in the American people, believed in one at a time and all American people at once. He really believed in our system, and so that was the way for him to change the country if he could.
Well, another clip, and this is later on in 1974 when Hubert Humphrey was gathering material for his memoir and made audio tapes, and we're going to use some of those throughout the program. But he talks a bit, and this is just one example, of the relationship that you referenced and how it really became very testy between Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey as the administration wore on over Vietnam. And he reflects on some of the ways that Lyndon Johnson used the powers of the office, the perks of the office, to keep his vice president under control. Let's listen.
Well, there wasn't a time that I ever got a plane that I didn't have to ask for. And believe me, if anybody would ever tell you that Johnson was extravagant, it surely wasn't with his vice president. Many times he would say to me, that it was better to take a smaller plane. He said, if you have a plane that's too big, there'll be too many people want to ride with you. You'll be encumbered with too many people who see that there's an extra seat that hasn't been used. And so from time to time on short trips, particularly up and down the Atlantic seaboard, I would take a King Air, a Beechcraft King Air or Queen Air, one of the smaller planes that was available, or a two-engine Convair that was a military plane. For our longer trips, we used the Jetstar. Never within the continental limits of the United States did we ever use Air Force One or Two, that is the four-engine jets. Those were reserved only, those were to be used by me only for overseas trips. And at no time was I ever permitted to bring a newspaper man or a person of the media, radio, television, or press, with me on any trip within the United States. The President forbid it, and of course I respected his command and his wish. I gather he felt that that the Vice President should be heard and seen, but not reported upon too much.
Of course, Lyndon Johnson had been the majority leader in the Senate when Hubert Humphrey had been serving there. These two men had a long relationship and served in leadership together. Could you talk more about how Johnson used the levers of power to control Hubert Humphrey?
Well, as I was saying earlier, when he had this argument with Johnson about Vietnam, Johnson shut him out, froze him out at that point for at least a year about any talk about Vietnam or any foreign policy, basically. He cut off his privileges, he shortened his staff. At one point he tapped his phones, and he did a number of things to basically control Humphrey. And he didn't want him speaking out against Vietnam, didn't want him speaking out about anything that Johnson might have, didn't want him to speak about, basically. He wanted to keep him quiet. And he had a way of calling them my planes, my boats, and Johnson did this sort of possessive, kind of attitude about these, as if they were his and not the American people. So he was very much in control of that, and Humphrey dealt with it a lot. There were times when he gave 3 or 4 speeches in 1 week, and he had to call and get permission for each plane for each speech for that week. So it was worse during that period, and that freeze lasted about a year, and then Johnson sent him to Vietnam.
Did Hubert Humphrey talk about how he reacted to this? He had to have been unhappy.
He was miserable for a long time during this freeze in particular, because Johnson was basically shutting him out of any of the inner circle, of his inner circle. So he was kind of on the outside, and he wasn't happy during that time because he wanted to be involved in what was going on. It was a bad time for him. But then he went back. He was sent to Vietnam a year later, and things changed in 1966.
We are going to walk around this exhibit tonight and give you some sense of the exhibit that's been put together here, showing the year 1968 with the focus on politics and our stops. And I wanted to remind you about your participation. In about 10-12 minutes, we're going to start taking telephone calls. Here's how you can do it. If you live in the Eastern or Central time zones, our number 202-737-0001. If you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, our number is 202-737-0002. And we really look forward to your comments on 1968, tumultuous year in American history, and the year in which Hubert Humphrey was a contender for President of the United States. Why don't you walk along with me, and we'll go to our next stop here. So how did you first get interested in Hubert Humphrey?
Well, I grew up here, so he was always in the air when I was a kid. And I spent some time working here and saw his archive. And the archive was just fabulous. And for a documentary filmmaker, that's, of course, goldmine.
The Humphreys had 4 children. Are the children still here, and are they active in politics?
His daughter is no longer alive. She died a couple years ago. His grandson Buck is more more involved in politics than the others. The sons are basically in sales, all of them. And Hubert, his Skip, Hubert III, his son, works for an advertising agency, I believe. So none of them are really in politics at this point.
Well, we are at the exhibit about the politics, the political life of Hubert Humphrey, which really was his life, but he wasn't born in Minnesota.
No.
Where was he born?
Born in Dolan, South Dakota, and it was about 90 miles from the Minnesota border into South Dakota, in one of those little railroad towns that dotted the South Dakota prairie, that went along the prairie. And he was born in 1911, and it was a remarkable little town. It's sort of an intellectual ferment going on there. His father was a druggist. His mother was a Methodist, sort of a social gospel person. So he got the politics in his father's drugstore and her social Methodist social gospel kind of feel. So he got it from both sides, and sort of, as Bill Moyers calls him, the great combination of the preacher and the politician. He got both sides.
He went to pharmacy school himself, so how did he end up in politics?
He went to pharmacy school largely for a job. He always really wanted to be in politics. He did it in a short time, to help his father with the drugstore. But I don't think he ever really wanted to be a pharmacist for life.
He ended up getting a doctorate, as I understand, in political
No, he
science?
didn't. Nope, he got a master's degree.
Master's degree?
Yeah, at LSU.
And what were his intentions? Why was he studying politics?
Well, initially he was going to get a doctorate. He was going to come back to the University of Minnesota, get a doctorate, and teach. That was his first idea. And then he was so good at public speaking, and he was so good at communicating, that a lot of people around him convinced him to run. And I guess deep down he probably really did want to run. So he ended up coming back to Minnesota and becoming mayor of Minneapolis. That's where he first started.
And when did he serve as mayor? And what was the city like then? Do you know?
Well, he came back from LSU, from the South, from grad school in 1940. And Minnesota had been a Republican state, and they'd never elected a Democrat to the Senate. And the reason why was because the non-Republicans were divided between the Democrats and the Farmer Labor Party. He helped to unite those two parties into the Democrat Farmer Labor Party, and built himself his own political base. And then that's how he, and the city was corrupt and bigoted, and all kinds of problems with segregation and things. And when he first came, Nation magazine called it the capital of anti-Semitism in the United States. And when he left, he got an award from the National Council of Christian and Jews for the things he did.
Talk a little bit about the DFL. Is it still active in Minnesota politics today? And Hubert Humphrey was really its founder.
Well, he was one of 2 or 3 people, but he was probably the greatest negotiator of the group.
And what does it stand for?
Democrat Farmer Labor Party.
But from an ideology standpoint, how does it distinguish itself from the Democratic Party as a whole?
Well, I don't know that it does anymore, but at the time, it was a group of farmers and laborers, obviously, who had probably differences. Well, it's a complicated story, but they probably had differences with the more professional sort of Democrats that were, the FDR Democrats. It was a split there, and they just didn't like each other. And Humphrey was one of the people that finally, convinced them that they're never going to win an election unless they get together. And the Democrat Farmer Labor Party at one point, I believe, had 1/3 of our legislature.
He ran for Senate when?
He ran for Senate in 1948 after the speech.
Successfully, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that speech. But I have a clip, not from them, but from 1960, when he first seriously thought about running for president. And this is just one of those joy of being a politician of Hubert Humphrey. Let's watch.
How do you think your race is going?
Well, like this roller coaster, it's been an uphill fight. But I think we've been doing quite well.
Now, would you mind telling me what has been the most exciting part of the campaign so far?
I just had it.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, I tell you, this is good fun.
Thank you, sir.
And politics ought to be fun.
Yes, sir.
So vote for Hubert. Hubert Humphrey, the president for you and me.
And there we see Hubert Humphrey just enjoying life. Did he bring this to his politics all the time?
All the time, yep. That was pretty much the way he ran. And he would light up a room. I mean, people that had met him would say that it would be 11 o'clock at night, and he would get off the plane and work till 3 in the morning, and everybody was asleep, and he'd still be like that. He could just do it. He could just run like that constantly, and he loved what he was doing.
And what were some of his other characteristics? I've read that he was known for talking a lot, for example.
Absolutely, but he was also a good listener. And people miss that part. He did talk a lot. In his speeches, he would come with a prepared speech and put it down and just talk for an hour. He knew a lot about a lot of different subjects. Really intelligent, an astounding memory. They figured that at the time that he maybe knew 5,000 to 10,000 people by first name.
What a politician's gift
really
to be able to remember names.
He could go to a
like
town,
that.
meet somebody, go back 5 years later, remember their name, their family's name, what they did for a living. I mean, remarkable memory.
Well, we're going to start taking some calls, and then we're going to learn a little bit more about his political philosophy and how he developed it. First up is Kurt in Copley, Ohio. Kurt, welcome to our conversation about Hubert Humphrey.
Well, thank you, and good evening, Ms. Swain, and it's a wonderful program to be participating in.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And you mentioned 1948, and I remember hearing, and I've watch some of the clips on YouTube and on the internet of an actor named Ronald Reagan who endorsed Hubert Humphrey in 1948 for the U.S. Senate, which were they, I mean, when you think about it, were they kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, even though they were both Democrats at that time? But also, I wanted to find out what Hubert Humphrey's relationship was with Barry Goldwater in the U.S. Senate versus what their private life was like. And also, did Hubert Humphrey and Jack Kennedy get along very well when they were running against each other for president in 1960 and in 1956 when they actually vied for the vice presidential nomination to run with Governor Adlai Stevenson, who ultimately they lost to Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee.
Right. Thank you so much, Kurt. Well, we're going to take those in order. First, his relationship with Ronald Reagan.
He was a lifelong friend of Ronald Reagan's, and Ronald Reagan was pretty much the same politics back in those days. He was the head of the Actors Union, the Actors Guild. He was a Democrat, and he pretty much had the same philosophy as Humphrey. Ronald Reagan changed. Humphrey remained the same. But they did remain friends all those years and a great respect for each other.
Barry Goldwater.
Barry Goldwater and Hubert Humphrey were even better friends. They were absolutely, the best story I've heard about their friendship was they were giving speeches in Iowa on the back of a hay wagon out on a farm. They just ripped each other apart in these back-to-back speeches, and someone drove through town later in the day and saw them having dinner together. So they were good friends.
This, if you could talk in general, Kennedy is next, but before we talk about Kennedy specifically, about the United States Senate, these are the times of very big names of the senators. People recognize the names from history books even today. And was there bipartisanship? Did people work across the aisle? Talk about what the Senate was like.
Absolutely. It was disagree without being disagreeable. That was really what was going on. There was a lot of camaraderie. Humphrey was friends with a lot of Republicans. He was friends with even some of the Dixiecrats who he differed with. He was friends with some of those people, and it was a different. And that it was more cordial, and I believe there was more camaraderie than there is now. But I'm not in the Senate now, but I can tell you that they were pretty close. Those people, they worked closely together.
JFK and their relationship.
JFK's relationship through the early years in the Senate, Humphrey, they voted together on many of the same bills. Humphrey helped him with farm legislation because he knew nothing about it. The relationship changed dramatically in 1960 during the election and during the primaries and then the election.
In what ways?
Well, they fought, they had these debates in the election, in the primaries in Wisconsin and West Virginia. And they got to know each other that way. And then when Kennedy became president, Humphrey gave him many of his ideas to use in his administration. And the Washington Post had called Humphrey the idea factory for the Kennedy administration because he had so many of the ideas. The Peace Corps, for instance, is one of
Hubert Humphrey's idea, the Peace Corps.
Oh, yeah.
Let's take a call next from Indianapolis. This caller's name is Jerry, and you're on the air, Jerry. Welcome.
How you doing, man? Sir, I love your show. But I got a question for the man. Back in 1968 and 1948, was Humphrey spending more time with on the civil rights movement with Dr. Martin Luther King and Kennedy and Humphrey and Lyndon B. Johnson?
Yes, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about his civil rights. In fact, why don't we get into that part on his worldview by showing a clip. This is from your film, The Art of the Possible. This is early in his career, which Hubert Humphrey talks about his view of the world and his brand of liberalism. Let's listen. All right, we don't have that clip as we're getting it ready. Why don't you help us understand what informed his politics?
Well, to answer the question too, the civil rights was long. It was in him from the time he was born, so it wasn't new to Hubert Humphrey. Lyndon Johnson was in a southern state and had to deal more with the whole idea of the issue of race and getting elected, so it was quite different for him. But Humphrey felt and believed deeply what he was up against, and what he actually did in that speech Lyndon Johnson called the most courageous political act in the 20th century, because he could have destroyed the Democratic Party, could have destroyed Truman and his own career. So he really believed in civil and human rights.
And as I understand that caller, he was asking about Humphrey's commitment compared to the other two. So really, to Lyndon Johnson and to John Kennedy.
Yeah.
Can you make a value judgment about how much they cared about the issue compared to Hubert Humphrey?
Kennedy was, Johnson probably was more in line with Humphrey. Kennedy was a reluctant civil rights person. He came to it later, and Bobby came to it even more. But it was an issue for Humphrey from the beginning, and it was an issue for Johnson, actually, for many years, too. Humphrey was much more passionate about it, I believe, and much more involved with the African-American community. He spoke at NAACP meetings, and he knew a lot of people. He didn't know Martin Luther King, of course, in '48 that early, but he did know a lot of other labor leaders. E. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin and other people who were around at that time. Yeah, so.
Let's listen to Cynthia in Sioux City, Iowa. Hi,
Good
Cynthia.
evening. I was a member of the television news team in Sioux City, Iowa, but I happened to be in Washington, D.C. reporting the day we withdrew from Vietnam, and I had the privilege of interviewing Hubert Humphrey on that very day. And he spoke about, I asked him how he felt about losing the Vietnam War, and he said he too was a casualty of the Vietnam War. He was quite emotional and had a tear in his eye. I wonder if you could talk more about his Vietnam policy.
Well, the two trips he made to Vietnam while he was vice president changed. The first trip was scheduled for him, and he went to a prescribed trip with all the stops planned for him, and he was watched pretty closely. And he saw only the good side of the war, spoke to the good generals, heard all the good news about the war. The second time, he decided to go on his own a year later. He went out on his own, went to hospitals, talked to people, and at that point, he quit cheerleading the war because he found out about the corruption in the South Vietnamese government and all of the other things that were going on with the war, and he realized it was lost. And he came back from the second trip in late 1967 knowing that the war needed to be over. But he was boxed in. He'd been speaking out for the war for the last year, the year previous, and Lyndon Johnson was not going to let him speak against the war, so he had himself in a bad situation. And that conflict lasted with him all the way through 1968.
So as the caller before alluded, the true great issues of Hubert Humphrey's political career were civil rights and the Vietnam War. And that 1948 speech that the caller talked about really launched Hubert Humphrey onto the national stage. We're going to listen to a clip from that speech to the convention in Philadelphia in 1948. And when we come back, we're going to be joined by another guest who'll be with us for the program. Juan Williams, Fox commentator, but also the author of a number of books that deal with the civil rights era in American history. To the 1948 clip now.
Mr. Chairman, fellow Democrats, fellow Americans, I realize that in speaking in behalf of the Minority Report on Civil Rights, that I'm dealing with a charged issue, with an issue which has been confused by emotionalism on all sides of the fence. I feel I must rise at this time to support the Minority Report, a report that spells out our democracy, a report that the people of this country can and will understand, and a report that they will enthusiastically acclaim on the great issue of civil rights. To those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late.
After all, I had been the destroyer of the Democratic Party, the enemy of the South. Hubert Humphrey, the quote-unquote nigger lover. But I never felt so lonesome and so unwanted in all my life as I did in those first few weeks and months as United States Senator.
And that second clip was Hubert Humphrey reflecting on what it was like coming to Washington in 1949 after his big speech in the 48 convention. Juan Williams, welcome to our conversation.
Be with you.
How important in the history of civil rights in this country was Hubert Humphrey?
Well, that 48 speech was truly a landmark. That's the moment at which you see organized politics get behind what we think of as the modern 20th century civil rights movement. That's the moment at which the Democratic Party sheds so much of its the paralysis engendered by being reliant on the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats. Remember, in that period, Democrats dominated the South politically. And it's at that point that you see someone rise up in the Democratic Party in the form of this very public convention. Remember, Hubert Humphrey's voice is heard nationwide as Speaker, the mayor of Minneapolis, at the convention. And here he is saying to people across the land via the medium of the day radio that this is an abomination. This is not what the Democratic Party, not what the American people should be standing for. He's speaking in terms of national morality and a call to justice, and he does it at a cost because you have the segregationists, the Dixiecrats, many of whom are leaders in the U.S. Senate and Congress, walk out of the convention. Of course, then it leads to third parties and all the rest. It has a tremendous consequence that will fall like dominoes throughout American history.
Name some of the names of the Dixiecrats who walked out of the convention.
Well, you have Senator Eastland. You know, I'm trying to think of some of the... Thurman would be the big one. But you have Eastland and some of the other governors and members of the Senate who are right there.
Now, question, how risky was it for Hubert Humphrey, Senate candidate, to put his neck out on the line for civil rights? Was it controversial here at home?
You're talking about now after he's become senator?
No, no. In '48 when he was running, so he was a candidate, wasn't he that year?
He was, but he was still mayor, but he was a candidate.
But he was a candidate.
Right.
So here, among the voters in Minnesota, to speak out for civil rights, was that considered?
He came back as a hero here. So yeah, he was. I don't think it resonated here fine. Other parts of the country, it was a real problem.
And did he offer any risk for Harry Truman in making this?
Absolutely.
And how did Truman feel about this?
When he first started the speech, Truman called him a pipsqueak and was really upset about it. He thought he had ruined the election for him, and he was really upset about the fact that Humphrey was speaking. And Truman was watching it on an early TV in the White House, and he condemned him for it. But he learned later on that it actually helped him, and he turned it around and used his speech to get the African American vote in the North, and that helped him win.
And what, for either of you, inflamed his commitment to civil rights? Where did this come from in him?
That's a good question. Nobody knows. His father, he got it from his father, but the question is, where did his father get it in the middle of South Dakota? His father just raised him to believe that people are people, and they had their own form of colorblindness. It was quite remarkable. I mean, there were no African Americans in the small town he was in. There was one Catholic family, one Jewish family, who both had crosses burned on their lawns. So, you know, it was inside him. It was innate. So I don't know what no one can really come up with a reason, but it certainly was there.
Let's go to another call. This one's from Andrew, watching us in Newburgh, New York. Andrew, you're on. Welcome.
Hi. Good evening. How you doing?
Great. Thanks. Your question?
I was hoping that you could comment a little bit on the relationship between Senator Robert Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, and how it developed from being political enemies in 1960 to 1968 when they were, vying for the Democrat presidential nomination.
Okay. RFK relationship.
The RFK relationship started really in 1960. He didn't really have much of a relationship with him before that. And it didn't start off well because of the way Humphrey was treated in the primaries by the Kennedys. And but he learned to like Robert Kennedy. They learned to be friends. He campaigned for Kennedy in '66 when he ran for the Senate. And in 1968, they had a meeting in May in early 1968, the Kennedy and Humphrey people. And they agreed that if Humphrey got the nomination, Kennedy would support him, and if Kennedy got the nomination, Humphrey would support him. So he was pretty much a inline Democrat. He was a party person, Bobby Kennedy, and so was Humphrey. So.
Next up is Ron in Everett, Washington. Welcome to the Humphrey discussion, Ron.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to jump back forward to the 1968 campaign again. Can you elaborate? It's my recollection that President Johnson actually in some ways tried to scuttle Humphrey's effort. And of course that was one of the closest popular elections in history. And for example, it's my recollection that if the bombing pause had been started a bit earlier, say a month earlier, that it might have made the crucial difference. Could you elaborate on that? Thanks.
Did Lyndon Johnson try to scuttle his bid for the White House?
Well, he never helped him. He didn't help him very much till the very end. And he did these kind of things where he had Nixon at the ranch, and then the next day he would have Humphrey at the ranch, and he'd bring all the press out for Nixon, and he would tell Humphrey no press could be there. So he did some really, and part of the belief is, among historians, is that Johnson believed that Humphrey might end the war and make him look bad, his legacy, and Nixon, he thought, might continue the war, and he might have very well been for Nixon until late in the campaign when Nixon played a few dirty tricks, and then he came out for Humphrey at that point. And he thought he might lose Texas at the end, which really didn't want to do. So he was really late in the campaign when he started working for Humphrey. But pretty much during the whole campaign, he was out of the picture. He really wasn't helping at all, and held Vietnam over him during the whole time.
Juan, I want to bring the story back to civil rights. So from the 1948 entry of Hubert Humphrey, and he built his campaign on this, the denouement really came in the early 1960s, 63 and 64, when civil rights legislation was being put forward. Tell that story, if you would, briefly.
Well, Humphrey's involvement is as the Democratic whip in the Senate. And you've got LBJ as president trying to, basically the inheritor of President Kennedy's mantle, President Kennedy's efforts to get civil rights legislation passed. But Kennedy, there was some doubt about his commitment to this, what he was willing to, was he willing to pay the price in terms of the Southerners who would oppose it. But after the Kennedy assassination, Johnson expresses sort of a recommitment to get this done in honor to President Kennedy.
And does he make Humphrey the point man on this?
Humphrey becomes the point man in the Senate. Mike Mansfield is the Senate Majority Leader, a Democrat, but it's Hubert Humphrey, the man who gave the 48 speech, the man who has been persistent in terms of calling for civil rights and justice as part of the Democratic agenda, who really takes up the cause in the Senate. And he's up against it because the rules were different then. You know, you could filibuster to no end, and basically I believe the numbers are like something like 67 votes were required in order to end the filibuster. And you know, if you look through history, there are very few points at which you get enough votes to end a filibuster, but certainly it's exceptional that you would get enough votes to end a filibuster on any piece of civil rights legislation. That's almost unheard of. And it takes a great deal of effort by Hubert Humphrey to hold off a Republican effort to just prolong this filibuster, and finally he's able to do it. I think he only gets something like 4 votes in excess of the 67 that are needed in order to call an end to it. And then, of course, what's interesting is, you know, the legislation couldn't even be put through the normal channels, because if it had been put through the Judiciary Committee, you would have run into none other than Senator Eastland. So it's kind of extra judicial process being put in place by Mansfield, but then engineered by Hubert Humphrey, and then the bill gets its overwhelming passage.
What were the opponents to civil rights constitutional arguments?
Well, the constitutional argument was largely states' rights, that we have a right to run our businesses. For instance, in a public place, we have a right to allow whoever we want in. You know, that the Constitution allows us to do that. Well, of course, that was one of the main arguments. But there were a number of them. But I want to say too that the Dixiecrats were really probably the biggest obstacle for him. He had a number of Republicans that were on his side. In fact, it was a coalition of Republicans and Democrats that made it happen, because they had the Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party, and those people were just, you know, there was no way you're going to change any of their minds. So it was an interesting group. Thomas Kuchel was the Republican on the Republican side, and Everett Dirksen eventually. So the opposition was real conservative Republicans. Like Barry Goldwater was against the Civil Rights Bill, for instance, and the Dixiecrats. That was his obstacle.
And the drama of this filibuster coming down to the wire. We're going to, just to give you a sense of what the arguments were like at the time, we have another clip, and this is Hubert Humphrey and Strom Thurmond debating the 64 Civil Rights Bill. It's a back-to-back clip, again with Hubert Humphrey talking in a speech about his strategy. So 2 clips back-to-back. Let's watch that debate from 64, and then we'll come back to our 2 guests.
And we know that fellow Americans who happen to be Negro have been denied equal access to places of public accommodation, denied in their travels the chance for a place to rest and to eat.
It's not public accommodations, it's invasion of private property. This will lead to integration of private life.
In the city of Birmingham, Alabama, up to 1963, there was an ordinance that said that if you were going to have a restaurant and you were going to permit a Negro to come in,
you had to have a 7-foot wall down the middle of the restaurant dividing the white from the colored. Now, how foolish this is, and isn't that an invasion of private property?
Senator, we live in a country of freedom. And under our Constitution, a man has a right to use his own private property as he sees fit. We must remember that this bill creates no jobs. So therefore, whose jobs are these Negroes, the minority, going to take? Are the Negroes' jobs or white people's jobs?
Every one of us has this weighing heavily on our conscience. And we must, as individual citizens, speak out against prejudice and bigotry and discrimination. And we must be willing to accept the fact that every American is entitled to equal rights under the Constitution and under the law. No less than that.
Well, the most difficult task that I have as the floor leader on the Civil Rights Bill is just being there, having to watch every move and make sure that at all times we have present or readily available 51 senators, because one of the tactics of the opposition is to call for repeated quorums, which means that we have to produce 51 senators to answer the roll.
That story of needing at that time with the Senate rules different, always to have 51 supporters of the legislation on the floor. So how did he organize the people to be there?
Oh, he had teams, and they would rotate. And at times when if they didn't get a quorum, the Senate would be shut down. It would work in the favor of the anti-civil rights people. And they were able to bring only 2 or 3 people in, leave them there, they go home, and 2 or 3 people more come in, and they had this rotating basis, and they would wear out the 51 people that had to be there. So they did things like drive to baseball games and pull a senator out of the baseball game, bring them back to the Senate, and when they had to get a quorum, and they did all kinds of things. And they had people, they had a list, and they had a schedule for senators that had to be in. I mean, it was really well done, but they had some moments when it didn't work. I mean, they had to get people from outside the Senate and bring them back, fly them back and things to get a quorum.
Was the opposition largely regional? Was it the Southern Coalition that opposed civil rights, or was it broader than that?
Well, you had Humphrey, for example. I'm sorry, you had Goldwater, for example, who's a Westerner and from Arizona. And his opposition was sort of libertarian, which picks up on what Mick was just saying, which is that, you know, this is a free country, it's a matter of private property. You shouldn't be telling a man what to do. And you see much of this then get reflected in Strom Thurmond's language. I think we just saw some of that. But Thurmond is not speaking just in terms of sort of rank racism, but he's saying this is a violation of my rights as an American to make personal choices and a violation of personal freedom. And Humphrey's having to come back and say, this is ridiculous, this is not a genuine argument. In fact, what you're doing is perpetrating the worst kind of racism, and you're oppressing people. And that becomes the argument. It's interesting to go back, I mean, just to listen to that clip, and, you know, we have such arguments today about jobs in our country and what's necessary to be done. And here you can hear Strom Thurmond saying, oh, well, this legislation doesn't produce jobs, and therefore blacks, or as he says, Negroes, are going to take the white man's job. You just think, oh my God. But clearly he was comfortable saying this, and it had some effect in that era. You know, it's not as if he was speaking into a void. To the contrary, it was generating a political response and strong opposition to the civil rights legislation.
Let's take a call from Jimmy in Williamson, West Virginia. You're on, Jimmy.
I'm so glad you called me, ma'am. This is wonderful. I haven't spoken but to one of the sons of Senator Humphrey in the last, well, since he died over the years. I think I spoke with Skip. I am Jimmy Wolford. I'm the fellow who sang the Hubert Humphrey songs. I have such a wonderful love for him over the years. He took me everywhere. I sang everything. He taught me politics. He had great respect for me because I came from a family who, my father worked the railroad, and my grandpa, the McCoys, worked coal mines. And Hubert Humphrey came back in here. He heard me sing on a radio station in Williamson, West Virginia in 1960. He gave me $25 a day to travel with him. And Teddy White wrote a book called The Making of the President. And Teddy became one of my best friends. And Teddy taught me a lot, and everyone in Minnesota that I've met and throughout America, and the great of people that I met, the Henry Fondas and the presidents and the vice presidents and the people all over this country. I'm 77 years old now, and I still record. I did record for Capitol Records for years, and I'm doing material now in the stories of the Hatfields and McCoys, my mama's family. Hubert Humphrey was, to me, like my father.
Jimmy, thank you so much for that personal story. You know of Jimmy Wofford's songs about?
Yeah. I'm not going to sing them, but I know them. Yeah, I know them. He was, and he's traveled with them all the time. He was with them very closely, and it's good to hear his voice. And you know, he's one person I had lost in this whole search for interviews. I didn't know where he was, so I'm glad he's alive and well. 77
years old. Thanks for calling in and adding that personal touch. We got to get one more relationship established here, which was over the course of his civil rights career and well, around the passage of the bill. Did he develop a personal friendship with Martin Luther King?
Well, he certainly knew King very well, and he had a relationship with King around this legislation, because it's interesting that if you look inside the reaction in the black community, I mean, remember, there are lots of people who are militants who don't see the value of this legislation. King, on the other hand, is saying, no, this is a necessary step. If you go back to the Great March on Washington '63, in large measure it says it's for jobs, freedom, etc., but in large measure it's to say to the United States Congress, pass the Civil Rights Act, pass the law, put it in place. And Humphrey is one of the great supporters of this at the time. He is at the March on Washington. He is someone who is emphatic in his support, even as you get people in the Dixiecrats saying, oh no, we shouldn't have a March on Washington. They're just trying to pressure us politically and all the fears that surround it. Humphrey was a total supporter and thought that it was a good and necessary step.
One other thing about he and Martin Luther King, at the early stages of the filibuster, he met with Martin Luther King, and he said to him, I want you to know that we're on the same page, and if I say some things to these Dixiecrats, because Humphrey's policy was to treat them with respect and try to go through it, you know, use the Humphrey way rather than the Johnson way, which was negotiate. If I say some things to them in public that you don't like, remember, I'm just saying this because I want the bill to get passed and we're on the same page, and don't get upset about it. So he had this great meeting with him before.
So we can hardly do justice to Hubert Humphrey's career before he ran for president himself in 1968, but at least you get some sense of his work on the national stage in civil rights that he took into the vice presidency, and then in 1968 when he decided to run for president himself. We didn't establish this, but very important, that Lyndon Johnson made the decision early in 1968 that he would not seek the office, thus setting the stage. At that point, how many Democratic contenders were thinking about challenging Lyndon Johnson?
Well, it was basically Bobby Kennedy and Gene McCarthy.
And they were anti-war candidates?
Yes, they were both anti-war candidates. And then Humphrey, it was April 27th, about a little less than a month later that Humphrey joined the...
When did Johnson announce?
29th of March.
And was that a surprise to the nation?
It was a shock to It was a shock to Humphrey, and he had shown up at Humphrey's apartment earlier that day. Humphrey was in Mexico before he left town, before he left Washington. He showed up at Humphrey's apartment and said, I'm going to give this speech. I've got two endings. I'm not going to tell you which one. I'm not even going to read them to you, but you should listen to the speech because you'll be surprised at one of the endings if I use it. He hadn't decided yet. So Humphrey was in Mexico, and he was called out to watch this broadcast, and he announced that he was leaving the office. And because of the chaos that was going on there, they thought that they heard that he was immediately leaving office, which would have made Humphrey president. And so there was all this, commotion, and then they realized that he was leaving at the end of his term. But it was a complete shock to him and to the country.
You know what's interesting about this to me is that, Susan, as you ask about who's running against him, it really was Gene McCarthy. And Gene McCarthy is the one who's in New Hampshire and taking on Johnson. Johnson's not actively campaigning, but clearly he has surrogates and people who are all around who stand for Johnson and for the kind of Democratic Party establishment of the time. Gene McCarthy is the anti-establishment, anti-Johnson candidate, and he has support from, people who are superstars of the era. I mean, today we still know Barbra Streisand or Burt Lancaster, but they're all people who are anti-Vietnam War, and of course all the college students are just emphatic about Gene McCarthy. And Gene McCarthy does surprisingly well in New Hampshire and legitimizes the idea that Johnson is vulnerable. And it's only after McCarthy's success that then you start to see Robert Kennedy willing to jump in. And then people are, questioning why is he jumping and trying to block Gene McCarthy because they think McCarthy has the momentum. And then, of course, that sets the table. But even as Hubert Humphrey's thinking that he, too, is trying to pull back on the war, he is pressured by the fact that he's loyal to the man who gave him the vice presidency, Lyndon Johnson. It's one of these, to me, wonderful political stories where you see someone saying, you know what, I mean, you can tell Hubert Humphrey's really a good guy, and he's not going to put Lyndon Johnson in a position where Lyndon Johnson feels that he's being undercut by his number two, the guy that he empowered. But at the same time, and as you and Mick have discussed earlier, Johnson is just totally dismissive of Humphrey, and especially Humphrey's contribution or desire to make a contribution, saying, you know what, this war is not the right war.
Let's get to another call. This is Larry in Sherman Oaks, California. Hi, Larry.
Hi. I'm a rather big fan of Humphrey's, and for many years it took me quite a while to accept the fact that he was never going to be president, even after his passing. So I was able to finally channel that energy into putting up my own Humphrey website, which I've had since 2002. And in 1998, I visited MHS along with the Humphrey Institute when Steve Sandell was there. We looked in the catalogs, didn't see any items surrounding the Middle East war in June. I would have thought Humphrey would have made some speeches or interviews or something. Didn't see anything, and that surprised me.
What was he involved in Middle East policy, and did he speak out on it?
He was, but I don't think, they were talking about June of '68, I guess is what they're talking about. I don't think that was at the forefront right at that point. He had just too much else on his plate, I think is what it probably was. I don't remember ever seeing anything either, and I've been through all of his archives. So.
With the early primaries and Lyndon Johnson's announcement, things start going into warp speed in 1968. It was a year of assassinations, the first being Martin Luther King's. What happened in the country with the King assassination?
Well, it's hard to summarize it, but let me just say that you immediately have riots. You have riots that are still mark cities like Washington, D.C., Chicago, Kansas City. It becomes a national moment of crisis, and you have people fearful that there's going to be large-scale racial war in the country after this assassination. It's the unrest that surrounded the Vietnam War is still present, but now it becomes a background, because remember, King was an opponent of the Vietnam War. And he had said that this was an unjust war and a wrong war, and why are black and white boys dying in this war? And there were people who were trying to join the civil rights movement with the anti-war movement. And King, who has not been political, King, who had condemned, said, there were flaws within the Democratic Party and flaws within the Republican Party, is becoming more political. And there are people inside the civil rights movement who recognize that Johnson has been so supportive in terms of civil rights, and Humphrey supported it. Why are you, Dr. King, now challenging this administration that's been so supportive of us? But King, nonetheless, says that he feels a moral imperative. Remember, he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and he feels a moral imperative to say that this is part of an injustice that's being perpetrated by America, that America is on the wrong side of world history in pursuing this war effort. You got 500,000 Americans at war, record numbers of deaths, and he is out there speaking against it. A year before he's assassinated, he's at the Riverside Church in New York, making a speech that gets lots of attention. Shortly before he's assassinated, he's at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., speaking against the war. And so it becomes part of the energy that surrounds him, and it puts him in the position of being an opponent of the Johnson administration.
Syracuse, New York, this is Ralph. You're on the air.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the contenders. I'm a proud UAW worker from upstate New York, and I have a quick comment and a quick question, and I'll hang up. But I have a video at home from the AFL-CIO, and the title of it is Words of a True Friend of Workers in Their Unions, and it was about Hubert Humphrey, and he was speaking at an AFL-CIO gathering. And it was towards the end of his life, and he's still smiling. He knew it was almost at the end. And he had a great quote at the end of his speech. He says, I'd rather live 50 years like a tiger than 100 years like a chicken, but I want to move up to 1968. And I met a guy about 20 years ago who said he worked on the Humphrey campaign in 1968. And he said that he came home after working on the campaign, and he was at this hotel, and he was looking out. He was looking out at this park, and the news came on, and said that there's Humphrey protesters having violence in the park. And he called Humphrey the next day when they had a meeting, and Humphrey says, I know Nixon's been doing it for a while, and there's nothing we can do about it. But I think Nixon, from this guy's story, Nixon was doing it to try to link Humphrey to anti-war protesters. And I was wondering if your guests have ever heard a story like this, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Well, I have heard stories of being paid protesters, and I've heard that in the civil rights movement too, I believe, where people were paid to cause trouble. And but you know, there's never been. It's hard to document, but you know, there were stories about it, and I'm sure it probably happened at times. But that's, you know, there's no way to know for sure.
He was a union caller. How important were the labor unions to the civil rights effort and the anti-war movement?
Oh, well, on the civil rights front, they were very important. It's funny, they were slow to come along. You think of A. Philip Randolph going all the way back to the 20s and 30s, trying to get the labor movement in this country to understand the importance. Randolph going all the way back to the 20s and 30s, trying to get the labor movement in this country to understand the importance of racial equity. But by the time of the 60s, you know, they're an essential part of the Democratic coalition. The Democratic coalition, part of that FDR legacy, if you will. And so here they are now linking hands with not only A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, but also Dr. King to support the March on Washington, making a show. I mean, the famous picture of Dr. King speaking at the March on Washington, he's got several people, you know, the meat cutters and others right behind him in that video, and you can see the union involvement, and you can see the head of the AFL-CIO and others right there with him. So it becomes not just a matter of a support mechanism, but a controlling mechanism, I think, for people in the Kennedy administration who wanted to be able to have some levers of control over the march and over the civil rights effort.
Well, we're going to take a call here, and then we've got to fast forward and fit a lot of history in, because just shortly after the King assassination, Robert Kennedy assassinated in Los Angeles. But let's listen to a call from Dean in Cleveland, and then we'll come back and talk about that. Hi, Dean.
Hi. I'm a fellow brother, also of the Cleveland building construction trades, and I don't want to turn this into a union rally, but my first ever political involvement in politics was with Hubert Humphrey. I was 18 years old, and I live in a suburb, an inner ring suburb of the city of Brooklyn, Ohio. And he had came to Brooklyn. He was the vice president of the United States. And you can imagine what was happening in 68 and 69 and all of the 60s for that matter. And he sat down and stayed in town for a couple of hours with our mayor, who turned out to be the mayor for 51 years. His name was John Coyne. And they were both mayors. They talked things over. And I wasn't allowed to vote. I was only 18. But I also got drafted the following year. But it's just a pleasure that the series that you're running, and Happy Warrior of Hubert Humphrey. Thanks for having me.
Hubert Humphrey, the Happy Warrior, the name that he was given throughout his political career. We are live from the Minnesota History Museum, the History Center in St. Paul, right by the Capitol. Beautiful building. If you're ever here, please come visit. They have a special exhibit on 1968, and we're using that as our backdrop to talk about the presidential campaign of 1968. Hubert Humphrey, one of his many bids for president, the one in which he actually got the Democratic nod. Unsuccessful in his bid, but as we're talking tonight, he made a major contribution to American history, and we're learning more about that. Well, in June, the California primary, and next politician, national figure to be gunned down, RFK. What happens to the campaigns at this point?
Well, I know what happened to Humphrey's campaign. It stopped for a good month. He just didn't feel comfortable campaigning at all under those circumstances. And it set him way back. And that's really the beginning of his numbers sliding, because earlier in the year, in the early primary season, he wasn't in the primaries, but he was ahead by as much as 10 points over every other candidate. Well, after Kennedy was shot, it looked like the Democratic Party was falling apart, really, and it stopped his campaign. So when he got back on his feet again in July, he was already behind Nixon, and then came the Republican convention, which sort of cemented Nixon's lead.
You know what I would say, too, is what stands out to my mind is that we were talking a moment ago about the King assassination, and Robert Kennedy gives an amazing speech that so many people still remember in Indianapolis on the night of the King assassination, because as I've described to you, there's rioting breaking out all over the country. There's this tremendous sense of racial anger and racial unease. And he talks about the King assassination in terms of his own brother's assassination and, you know, kind of drops of pain and all that we can do to try to ease that pain, but the patience that's required. And then, you know, just a few months later, here he is laying dead in Los Angeles. And I think that, again, the sense is that America's leaders are being killed, people who are the idealists, people who were to carry on the grand traditions of liberalism, people who are challenging the establishment are being eliminated. There is this great sense of sadness and despair in the American body politic at that moment. And it's hard to capture the extent to it. I mean, sometimes we have arguments today about what's going on in Washington, paralysis, polarization, and people always say to me, if you were here in '68, you would understand how bad things could have been, that it felt like the country's coming apart. It feels like we don't know the forces of evil that are at work and why so many great American leaders are being killed at this moment. And don't forget, President Johnson's approval numbers are like in the low 30s. He can't even come out. I mean, he can't attend major events. He won't be able to go to the Democratic convention, and there's rioting at the Democratic convention. I mean, it's really an incredible moment, '68, and Hubert Humphrey is there. We were talking about the happy war. Hubert Humphrey's there, and he wants to be anti-war, and he wants to stand up with people and say, you know, there's reason to hope America can do it. But he is seen as an establishment figure because of his association with the incumbent Lyndon Johnson.
So our cities are burning, kids are rioting on college campuses, our leaders are being gunned down, and all this, people are trying to vie for the office and bring America to a next stage. We're going to go to a next stage as well. We're going to walk down the aisle here and listen to a call as we do, and our next stop is going to be about the opposition as it's gathering, both with George Wallace and also the Republicans. Let's listen to Jim, who's watching us in Sodus, New York. Hi, Jim.
Hi, how are you?
We're great, thanks. What's your question about Hubert Humphrey?
Well, let me first say that how much I'm enjoying this program. I really appreciate it. My question really, though, deals with the first draft lottery, which I believe was in either 67 or 68. I do have great recollection of being eligible for that, having a very low number, which, of course, upset everyone in my family. What was Humphrey's position relative to that, the whole concept of the lottery? What did he do, pro or con, in that issue?
You know, I don't know that I've ever heard Humphrey say anything about the lottery, but I do know that later on he worked, and at that time he worked to raise the voting age, as I said earlier, because he thought it unfair that people were being drafted at 18 and couldn't vote till they were 21. And I think later on, later in his life, he had different ideas about it, and he probably felt that the draft itself probably wasn't such a good idea. But at the time, I don't know that he really said anything about it that I remember.
So summer of 1968, and the country's in disarray. The Democratic Party, with the assassination of both Dr. King and then Bobby Kennedy, are in disarray. Jules Wickover reported that Gene McCarthy lost his heart to campaign after the assassination. But on the Republican side, Richard Nixon, who had also been in the Senate, also former vice president, wanted to be president as well. What was his campaign's reaction to all of this turmoil? How were they positioning their man?
Well, you know, the principal response from Nixon was law and order, that he wanted to restore law and order in the streets. He wanted to get the counterculture, all the young people who were so vociferous in their anti-war efforts and, you know, protesting on campus and shutting down the campuses, wanted to get that under control. And he appealed to then a group that is now, you know, it's a famous name, but the silent majority in American politics, who felt as if they were being put upon by this counterculture and all these young people, some of whom had supported Gene McCarthy. Now, what's interesting is that Nixon in this period is a guy who, you know, himself has concerns about the war, has questions about it, but he's positions himself as a staunch supporter of the military and the war, as a counter, I think, to some of the Democratic efforts and to separate himself out from the Johnson forces.
And Hubert Humphrey still struggling, as you described, boxed in by being loyal to his president, and Johnson demanding loyalty as we get into the campaign. And so the two candidates were able to distinguish themselves.
Well, let me just say before that, it's interesting if you look on the Republican side, it's not only Nixon that's running, but you've got Romney. Remember George Romney?
The father of the current candidate for president.
And Romney was trying to position himself as anti-war. And it leads to what I guess we all will remember as the most famous moment in George Romney's presidential run when he says he's been brainwashed by the generals and the political leaders about what's going on in Vietnam. And of course, saying that he was brainwashed then alienated some of that silent majority base because they wanted to see the war continued and to win the war. Romney thought that he could, you know, outflank Nixon by being the anti-war Republican. Turns out he hurt himself with his base, and he really is never able to challenge Nixon after that. And then you also have, you know, I mean, you have people like Harold Stassen, but I mean, that's a little
Nelson
bit.
Rockefeller was also
Rockefeller is in that mix, Romney's in that mix, and guess who? Ronald Reagan's in that mix. Reagan is the strong conservative as opposed to Nixon at the Miami convention, and ultimately it comes down to Rockefeller and Reagan kind of knocking each other out and allowing Nixon then to have a clear path to the nomination in Miami.
Let's take a call from Fred watching us in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Hi, Fred.
Hi there. I just wanted to mention one of my favorite stories about Hubert Horatio Humphrey when he was the mayor of Minneapolis. The Bell Telephone Company was to go out on strike. And the mayor's office, as the story goes, overlooked the Bell Telephone Company across the street, and he saw them taking in mattresses and food and being brought into the building to prepare for a long strike. So he ordered the inspectors to go over there, and Bell Telephone Company had no hotel or restaurant permits. So he ordered them to empty the building of all that stuff, and it solved the strike. It was over. And Hubert Horatio Humphrey was always a great friend of the working people, and that's my comment.
Okay, thanks for telling that story. Let's move right on to another call from Nancy in Norton, Virginia. Hey, Nancy.
Hi. I was 14 years old in 1968. I'm from Appalachia, but I was visiting in Washington, and my older cousin was a Humphrey supporter. I was always very proud of that. I wanted to ask, since I heard on MSNBC earlier that the Occupy movement is coming to D.C. December 5th through the 9th, of what your guest could offer in regard to recognizing paid provocateurs. I know Dr. King studied at the Highlander Center for Nonviolence in Knoxville, Tennessee, and all the 99%ers I approve of are nonviolent, and if they have any advice about that. Washington's not a city, it's a crime scene. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Well, yeah, he studied at the Highlander School, as did Rosa Parks and others who were involved with the Civil Rights Movement. And of course, initially, a Highlander School is there to help people involved with union activities who are fighting against coal miners and the like, and teach them how to organize. But then, of course, those tactics extend to civil rights protests and the like. Obviously, in the case of the bus boycott that Rosa Parks and Dr. King become so well known for in 1955 in Montgomery. But extending that now in terms of the lessons that you would take to something like Occupy. Remember that when King is assassinated, King was intending to come to Washington to lead a poor people's campaign in '68. And the Poor People's Campaign was going to be right there on the National Mall, right in front of the U.S. Congress and the Capitol. And the idea, as Dr. King expressed it, was he wanted to show the leaders of the free world, of the greatest country, the richest country in the world, that there was still need and poverty, including in Appalachia that Nancy was talking about, but also in the big cities. And he was going to build, these shanty huts right there on the mall. Talk about an Occupy movement. There's a direct analogy to that, and of course there was the fear that this was going to attract all sorts of anarchic, bad elements, and of course that's exactly what we're seeing in terms of Occupy.
We've been talking about Richard Nixon, and we've got a clip. It's from a little bit later, but during the general election, but it talks about the fact that there were no debates and during the general election, and there was a lot of discussion about whether there would be. Here's Richard Nixon talking about not debating Hubert Humphrey.
I happen to be of the opinion that we need a debate in this country. I think that you and Mr. Humphrey should get at Vietnam and some other questions.
Well, I think Mr. Humphrey's having a great time debating himself after this.
You're prejudiced, Mr. Nixon. If you don't want to debate with the third-party candidate, whose name shall not be mentioned, why don't you get your friends in the House of Representatives to pass a special law permitting you and Mr. Humphrey to debate?
Have you ever looked at the membership on that committee? You know, it's always amusing to me when people say, well, now, why don't I get the Republicans to do something on a debate or the rest? Let's remember that the Senate is 2-to-1 Democratic. Let us also remember that the House is 3-to-2 Democratic. And any time that Hubert Humphrey, with his great influence on his side, wants a debate, I would think that he would be able to get the Democrats to pass it. I think that my power in terms of what I could get the Republican members in the House to do is greatly overestimated. You want to understand it, Democrats as well as Republicans apparently are insisting on the three-man debate.
Well, don't you think
that's the problem, as you know. It isn't that they're not opposing the debate, but they say that with Wallace getting 21% of the poll, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned his name because you don't, but nevertheless, with Wallace getting 21% of the poll, they're insisting that they can't, in effect, go back to their constituents unless they provide him an equal chance.
But if you got your friends and Mr. Humphrey got his friends, surely you'd have enough friends to bring this thing off, wouldn't you?
I don't think he's got that many friends.
A glimpse of Richard Nixon talking about the 1968 campaign. The focus of our discussion here and the Contenders program featuring Hubert H. Humphrey, Democratic candidate for president, unsuccessfully in 1968. Well, we're going to take a call from Jim, and Richard Nixon talked about George Wallace. We're going to listen to Jim, and then we're going to talk about George Wallace. Jim, you're on the air, East Brunswick, New Jersey.
Yes, hello. Great series.
Hello, Jim.
Great show. Hello. Yes,
we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have a purely speculative question I wanted to ask primarily to Mick in dealing with the power of celebrities in 1968 that supported in the primaries mainly Kennedy and McCarthy, and after the announcements of bombing halt possibilities, that many of them came flocking back to Humphrey, and many participated in a election eve telethon called Call Humphrey Muskie. And many of these stars were there, Frank Sinatra, Steve Allen, Paul Newman, Sonny and Cher. And there was a Harris poll taken the next day on Election Day saying that Humphrey would win. And my question is, do you think that if these stars and that sort of vehicle, this marathon telethon taking questions live on the air, that Humphrey may have pulled it off if these people had come to him earlier in the fall of '68?
Well, Gene McCarthy called in that program, and it certainly would have helped probably if he'd come earlier in the year, if he'd called in or joined the Humphrey campaign. But there was a lot else going on at that time besides the telethon. There was they thought they had peace in Vietnam right the weekend before, that week before. And Humphrey's poll ratings jumped, just kept going up almost past Nixon in most polls, because peace in Vietnam would have won him the presidency. And Nixon sent Madame Chennault to South Vietnam and convinced Hsu, the South Vietnam leader, to not come to the peace talks because Nixon would give him a better deal if he were president. And this happened, and it's documented all over the place. So he backed out of the peace talks. Our ally, the South, backed out of the peace talks. And many people believe that's what really lost the election at the end.
Okay, we mentioned George Wallace. Right behind you is a campaign poster for George Wallace. When did he come into the race, and what bloc did he represent?
Well, he represents kind of Southerners who were alienated, not only by Humphrey, but by the student protesters. I mean, he's representing working class people, actually, even in the northern cities, who really, I think, are frustrated with the entire climate. They think that there's a lack of law and order. They think that the minorities, the blacks, are out of control, and they think that nobody's listening to them. This is kind of the Archie Bunker element, if you will, and that's who Wallace comes to represent. And it's a substantial feeling because a lot of these people, remember, would have been Democrats. They're Union people or they're Southerners, but they are not in line with what's become of the Democratic Party in terms of the Gene McCarthys, the Ed Muskies. They're just not there. And Wallace gives form to their feelings.
So, in the interest of time, we've got to fast forward the story. The Republicans meet in Miami for their convention in the summer of '68. The Democrats convene, as we said at the outset, in Chicago, with their party with serious fractions about the war. And Chicago was what kind of scene?
Where do you begin with Chicago? Humphrey tried to get the camp, it's little known, but Humphrey tried to get the whole convention moved to Miami, because he knew it was coming, and Johnson wouldn't do it because he was so close with Daley, and he had promised Daley that he would have the convention there. There were strikes, all kinds of strikes. There were cab strikes, there were communication strikes, I think there was a phone strike, there were barricades up. They expected 5, 10, 15,000 protesters. I mean, it was chaos, and he was worried about threats to his family. There had been threats to kidnap his wife, and he arrived at the convention without a peace plank. He had a peace plank that we bring to the convention that would talk about ending the war, and Johnson squished it right at the end. And so he ended up coming to the convention.
Did he have the nomination in hand when he got there?
I think he did, yeah. People were nominated in different ways in those days. It wasn't by primaries, it was by the bosses, the delegates, and he had most of the delegates by way of Lyndon Johnson. That was another thing Johnson held over him, is he had some sway with the delegates that would nominate him for the presidency.
And in fact, I mean, that's a critical moment in terms of all American political history, because Humphrey's the last one, the last nominee who gets the nomination through the bosses and not through the primary process. So you get people like Daley and the other big city mayors and the union leaders who get behind Humphrey, again, almost out of anger at the counterculture movement and the anti-war movement. And, Daley's not only beating up, I might say, on the protesters in the street, he's beating up on media inside the convention famously, and it's a horrible scene, and in terms of the American public that's watching this, a huge turnoff.
Richard Daley was determined to have law and order. What kind of forces did he marshal?
The police force there and the National Guard are all on the streets, and they are, whipping heads. It's a really horrible scene, and Humphrey's put in the position of saying he stands with the bosses against people who are breaking down law and order civilization, the anarchists in the streets and the drugs that then are also being featured and the free sex and all the rest. And he's trying to, I think, appeal to that silent majority and saying, he stands for law and order. Democrats are not an out-of-control party. It's ironic because, Hubert Humphrey was a guy who was not a great supporter of the war. He was not a machine guy. He was an idealist. But in this moment, he becomes a representative of that big city mayor, union boss, LBJ, bullying hardball politics.
Let's go back to calls. This is all the way from Honolulu. Mike is watching us there. Mike, you're on. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, aloha, ahi. I really enjoy your program, and it's especially the history involved. I'm 69 years old now, and I remember in 1960, I was in high school. I worked for Kennedy, and of course he was running against Hubert Humphrey. And also, Hubert Humphrey had a little campaign slogan or a little campaign jingle that was to the tune of "Give me that old-time religion." And of course, Kennedy was a Catholic. So, anyways, I remember that. And of course, we go back to 68, and I was married then. And of course, I voted for Humphrey. And I wonder, my question for the author is this: was there any animosity between the Kennedy camp in '68 and Hubert Humphrey because of Hubert Humphrey's anti-Catholic campaign in 1960. Thank you.
I assume he means that it was still there in 1968. I don't think so. I think it was gone by that point. But however, the things that John Kennedy did to Hubert Humphrey in that 60 campaign, this paled in comparison. He basically bought that election in West Virginia, the primary election.
We have a clip that we didn't show from 1960. I'm going to take a call, and we have JFK talking about Hubert Humphrey from 1960. That'll just help illustrate some of the relationship. But let's, as we're getting that ready, let's listen to John in Knoxville, Tennessee. Hey, John.
Hey, Hubert Humphrey and Gene McCarthy were close friends for many, many years as fellow DFLers. And at the end of the terrible convention in Chicago, McCarthy told Humphrey that he would come out and actively support him soon. And I think the assumption was like in September. But McCarthy never did. And that was a terrible burden for Humphrey, and probably McCarthy could have swung enough votes to get Humphrey elected. And I'm just wondering whether our experts share that view or whether they have some other view.
Thank you.
Well, I share it for sure. We interviewed Walter Mondale, and he said that if McCarthy would have come out on the stage at the convention and said, Humphrey's not our best candidate, and we're against the war, but we need to vote for him rather than Richard Nixon, then he would have won the election. They had a meeting a couple weeks before the convention where McCarthy told Humphrey he'd come out for him by mid-September, never did. And Humphrey, what people didn't know is Humphrey and Miles Lord, who's a friend of both of those two people, were talking constantly all through the campaign, trying to get McCarthy to come on board with Humphrey, and he wouldn't do it. Left the country for a while. No one knows why.
If you've joined us along the way, McQuet has done a documentary on Hubert Humphrey. We've got a copy of it. We're going to show you a little bit later on, the cover, so if you're interested, you can follow up on it. Many of the clips we're showing tonight are from his research and some from his documentary itself. One of those is this 1960 JFK talking about his relationship with Hubert Humphrey and his influence on his presidential campaign.
This week, I had the opportunity to debate with Mr. Nixon. I feel that I should reveal that I had a great advantage in that debate, and I'm not referring to anyone's makeup man. The advantage that I had was that Mr. Nixon had just debated with Khrushchev, and I had debated with Hubert Humphrey, and that gave me an edge.
Debating with Hubert Humphrey gave him an edge. We're going to go back to calls. Greg is in Rapid City, South Dakota, and Greg, you're on. Welcome to the conversation. Hello, Greg.
Hello.
All right, we're going to move on. Oh, there you are. Almost lost your chance. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just with Humphrey and LBJ's this kind of relates to what you guys were talking about earlier, but Humphrey and LBJ's relationship. What exactly happened? Why would he have to tap his phone over someone to Vietnam?
Okay, thanks very much. It really, as I understood it, why would he attack his own over Vietnam, the LBJ Hubert Humphrey relationship? Why would
LBJ attack Hubert Humphrey over Vietnam? Well, because LBJ wanted to win that war, and he didn't want anyone telling him, getting off the, off the farm about it. He wanted people to do what he told them to do, and Humphrey had reservations about the war, and he knew it, and he just didn't want him to. Humphrey had been a free spirit his whole career, and all of a sudden he was in this situation where he had to be controlled, and Johnson knew he could cause him damage by speaking.
I think basically he was protecting his own legacy.
Yes, he was. That's right.
We're going to close out our discussion of the 1968 convention with a clip. Remember, 68 National Guardsmen who were students themselves, who were in the streets holding back student protesters on the convention floor, melees with reporters. This is Hubert Humphrey in a clip from the convention as he accepts the nomination.
Listen to this immortal saint. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Those are the words of a saint. And may those of us of less purity listen to them well. And may America tonight resolve that never, never again shall we see what we have seen.
I was heartbroken. It was the moment of my life, the convention, and all at once there was this total disarray. I again was constantly posed with the problem, what do I do under these circumstances?
And that last was a clip directly from Mick Coet's documentary about Hubert Humphrey, reflecting on that terrible turmoil at the 1968 convention. Well, we have just about 35 minutes left. We're going to move along to the next part of the exhibit here and take some seats and round out our discussion of Hubert Humphrey's life and career, continue taking your telephone calls. And as we do, we're going to show you some of the Humphrey commercials from the 1968 presidential campaign. We'll see you in just a couple minutes.
What have the Democrats ever done for you? Well, let's think about it. Your kids are getting a better education today because Democrats have given schools needed federal aid. And when school is out, your kids won't have to wander the streets. Democrats have paved the way for them to get good summer jobs. You've got more money today for those little luxuries because Democrats worked hard to push through a higher minimum wage. You don't have to worry about supporting your mother today, and she needn't worry about being a burden on you, thanks to Social Security and Medicare. Quite an accomplishment? You know it. And you only heard a minute's worth. What have the Democrats ever done for you and yours? Think about it.
Paid for by Citizens for Humphrey Muskie.
The Vice President of the United States. We have seen the terrible results of violence in this country. It would be intolerable if a handful of violent people, and that is what it is, just a handful, could harden us against needed change. I've seen an uglier violence too, and it perverts the very spirit of America. I saw it at the Republican Convention in 1964 when Governor Rockefeller was shouted down. I saw it in Minneapolis when Governor Wallace, a man with whom I disagree, was heckled into silence. And it happened to me in Philadelphia. We must give notice to this violent few. There are millions of decent Americans who are willing to sacrifice for change, but they want to do it without being threatened, and they want to do it peacefully. They are the non-violent majority, black and white, who are for change without violence. These are the people whose voice I want to be.
The preceding was a pre-recorded political announcement paid for by Citizens for Humphrey.
Mr. Nixon, where do you stand on federal aid to education? Mr. Nixon, where do you stand on expanded Medicare? Mr. Nixon, where do you stand on aid to higher education? Mr. Nixon, where do you stand on the wheat program? Where do you stand? Where do you stand? I must say he's the...
You know something? Richard Nixon hasn't won an election on his own in 18 years. Let's keep a good thing going.
Those were campaign commercials from the 1968 Humphrey campaign as we talk about Hubert H. Humphrey, our featured contender in our series of 14 men who sought the presidency and lost but changed American history. We are live from the Minnesota History Center in St. Paul, Minnesota. And this is a special exhibit they're doing on 1968, which you tell me, Mick, is going to travel to other cities. Is that right?
Chicago, for sure. And I believe it's Atlanta or Charlotte.
Well, Charlotte.
I might be wrong.
Chicago is certainly appropriate after what we've been
Yes,
talking about. So it's time to talk about the fall campaign. Juan Williams here on my left and Mick Coet on my right. Both of them have worked extensively in this period. Juan's written a number of books about the civil rights era. So the fall campaign, we've now got Wallace, Nixon, and Hubert Humphrey all vying for the White House. We had riots in the cities in the spring. What was the fall like? Did they continue?
Well, there was some rioting that persisted, but it wasn't of the major kind of, smoke in the skies variety that we saw earlier in the year. But the racial tension was palpable throughout the country, and it's interesting the way that Nixon presented himself was as someone who was going to restore order in the big cities. So this was also had a strong appeal to people who felt that this civil rights movement now has sowed chaos, and that it's way beyond just a matter of equality, but it's now creating instability in the country. And combined with the anti-Vietnam War sentiments, you get Nixon as the guy who's the man of stability, law and order, the man who's saying that, we can win in Vietnam, even though later we'll know after the election he goes on to be someone who starts to pull out from Vietnam. But in this moment, he clearly understands that he's appealing to this so-called silent majority, and that's what his campaign is about.
And Hubert Humphrey comes out of the Chicago Convention on Vietnam still tied to Lyndon Johnson's policy?
Probably worse, because Lyndon Johnson does have a fund he's holding on to that he doesn't release to him. The Democratic National Committee has no money. He has no money. He has to borrow money to start his campaign. No TV ads, no promotion whatsoever, and he's 20 points down in the polls. That's how he starts his campaign.
It's pretty bad.
It's really bad, yes.
So how does it play out?
Well, he runs into, it continues like that for until the end of September. He is booed off stages in Seattle and other places from the protesters, and it continues and nothing changes. And then he gives a speech in late September, September 30th, in Salt Lake City, where he sort of, he had a little left to lose at that point, and he sort of makes a break with Johnson in a real subtle way, where he calls for a bombing halt under certain circumstances and bringing the troops home. And things changed instantly. He got something like $1 million in cash after that come into him, and people saw it as a change. And the next place he went, it was Humphrey, we're for you.
To give you a sense of what it was like for Hubert Humphrey campaigning out after the election, here is a scene from those months, and the popular refrain that he met from protesters, "Dump the hump." Let's listen.
And I proceeded to go out the door, the main door, walking across that campus with students, with the protesters on each side of the sidewalk, pushing and shoving and cursing and doing everything they could to harass me. And one of the things that they were doing was throwing cans of urine at me and my party and other human excreta. It was a terrible ordeal, but I walked every step. I didn't run one. I did no running. I got to my car. I stood alongside of it, waved back at the students, and we started to drive away.
I believe that the Republican candidate owes it to the people to come out of the shadows.
What you heard and saw there was Hubert Humphrey in 1974 reminiscing about a visit to Stanford University, and then scenes from visits to events in Boston and Seattle. We're going to go back to telephone calls on Hubert Humphrey. Next is Dallas. This is Shirley. Hi, Shirley.
Hi. I first heard Hubert Humphrey when I was in my 20s. He was the mayor of Minneapolis. He was on a program called Town Meeting of the Air, and he made a speech in favor of civil rights similar to what he did in 1948. And since then, he was always my political hero. And I'd like to ask a question. Would someone wasn't he active in the anti-nuclear weapons issue towards the end of his political career? I'd like to hear more about that.
he was actually earlier in his career. He actually was the force behind the Disarmament Agency and the Test Ban Treaty, and he started. He couldn't get in the middle of the 1950s. He couldn't in the late 1950s. He couldn't get the Senate and the Congress to, because of the Cold War, to actually talk about disarmament and talk about negotiating with the Russians. And so he started a subcommittee and set up this whole thing by himself, and it ended up in the Test Ban Treaty. And when the Test Ban Treaty was signed by President Kennedy, he turned to Humphrey and said, "Hubert, this is yours. I hope it works."
You know what I always remember on this front is we're talking about the general election in '68. George Wallace is there, but George Wallace's vice presidential candidate is General Curtis LeMay. And LeMay, at one point, suggests that the United States might use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. I mean, and of course, you know, people are alarmed by this. People have not forgotten what happened in terms of the A-bomb and all the rest. And it just, again, is an example of how extreme and harsh this year was, and how the campaign, the '68 campaign, is about war, immense social change taking place in the country. We talked about the civil rights movement, and especially the idea of assassinations, but there's also a feminist movement. The campuses are on fire and aflame, and young people are just angry. The draft is going on, and there's great discontent about that. It's just, again, this period that is, you know, it shapes so much of all politics that's to come subsequently. We're going to see the change that we've been talking about out of the Democratic primary process, because after that, no longer is it the case that the big bosses, the union bosses and the mayors are dictating everything, and you're going to see the need for the Democratic Party to come back together, and it doesn't do so for a very long time. And of course, subsequently, we see the trajectory in which the South becomes increasingly Republican.
Well, you mentioned vice presidential candidates, nominees. Richard Nixon, of course, choosing Spiro Agnew. Hubert Humphrey chose Edmund Muskie. Mm-hmm. How did that alliance come together?
Well, he had known him for quite a while, and everybody, of course, wanted him to have a Southern candidate to pull some of the South. And he said, "I want someone who I think would be a good president if something happens to me." And, you know, the assassinations were very fresh, and they knew that, you know, a vice president is a heartbeat away, as they said. And so he wanted someone that he liked and someone that was stable. It didn't really help him much politically, and he wasn't thinking along those lines. But I should say, too, that he also, what's little known is he also spoke to Nelson Rockefeller about being his vice president, crossing party lines, which would have been pretty remarkable. Nelson Rockefeller gave it 24 hours and said he couldn't do it, just couldn't do it, but they were friends, and Rockefeller didn't have any special liking for Nixon. So.
Next telephone call is from Annandale, Virginia. You're on the air.
Hi, Susan and gentlemen. I'm thoroughly enjoying the series. I was intrigued about the comment earlier that Humphrey was the originator of the idea for the Peace Corps and a lot of other ideas for Kennedy. I wonder if Kennedy ever gave him credit for those ideas and what some of the other ideas of his were.
Well, as I said, he gave him credit for the Test Ban Treaty, I think pretty much publicly. He gave him credit for Food for Peace program. I have a speech where he said that. I don't think he ever said so about the Peace Corps. And there were a lot of things that I don't think he said specifically, but I think he might have said, you know, that Humphrey helped, these were Humphrey ideas, some of these ideas, because he took them from the 1960 campaign. Humphrey, when he lost the primary to JFK, he said, "I want to get my ideas into his administration," so he worked on them.
Hubert Humphrey, by the way, was 57 years old. He was born in 1911, so in 1968, 57 years old. And how did he present himself as a candidate, gentlemen? Was he, I mean, we have all this change going on in society. Was he conventional? Was he
extremely conventional? I mean, we talked a little bit about the difficulty he had portraying himself as an opponent of the war. But you know what? Remember, you know, as you just pointed out, Susan, he's born in 1911. He's not a counterculture guy. There's no way that he's going to be standing around in a dashiki or with long hair and, you know, be credible. And in fact, what he's trying to do is say that he understands the need for stability and law and order, even though he's not the law and order candidate. And so he's in a suit and tie, and he has difficulty even with the kind of poetics that Robert Kennedy had employed, you know, when Kennedy was when King was assassinated. That's not Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey is a great speaker. But how do you speak when, as we just saw in that clip, you have people screaming at you, dump the hump, who see you as, basically an operator for Lyndon Johnson, who's extremely unpopular. So he's in a vice, a political vice that to this moment seems like a squeeze to me.
And it was impossible for him to present himself as anything. I mean, it was done for him.
Yeah.
He didn't have much chance to really be himself. But interestingly enough, he was the revolutionary in 1948. So he was in the other role in 1948, and he became part of the very establishment that he, like it or not, that he attacked in 1948.
But a big change in the country from 48 to 68. Yeah. Next telephone call, Belfast, Maine. Pat.
Hello.
Hi.
I worked for Hubert Humphrey. My husband in the 60s was his press secretary. I was Muriel Humphrey's press secretary. And
oh my
we
goodness.
were involved in his 1960 campaign. We were with him through all of 1968. We were at the Democratic Convention and the horror and tragedy of what was unfolding. And I had the experience of escorting Muriel Humphrey and their children through the basement of the convention center with tear gas seeping all around us as we were going into the convention hall on the evening that he would get the Democratic nomination. And that night, from the hotel room at the Conrad Hilton, we were with him as he stood there looking out the window at the violence and the terrible tragedy unfolding in Grant Park. And the atmosphere in the room was almost of a funeral. And Humphrey was the saddest man you can imagine on the night that he had achieved his greatest political victory to be the Democratic presidential candidate.
Great irony of Humphrey's life.
This was a man whose ideals and integrity carried through his whole life, and in his personal life, when you knew him at home, when you were with him privately, he was the same person with the same passion, the same conviction for civil rights, for working Americans, for the concerns of world peace that you heard in his public statements. And I don't think we have had somebody with his gifts in the years since.
Pat, our time is short here, but are we doing your boss justice tonight? Is there one aspect of his political career that you think it's important for our viewers to hear about?
I think you're doing a beautiful job on him. You've touched on so many things. I was happy that he was being given some credit for the tremendous array of ideas and programs that he actually generated and then championed during the Kennedy administration. And
thank you for your call. What's your family name? I'm sure your name will be known.
My last name is Griffith. My husband wrote a biography of Hubert Humphrey in 1963 called Humphrey, a Candid Biography. So it's one of the
Great. Thank you so
sources.
much for being part of our conversation. Great to have your personal stories really added to our understanding of the 68 convention. We have just 15 minutes left, and we've got still a long life of Hubert Humphrey to cover here. So let's talk about election night. Where did he watch the returns?
I believe he was, boy, now you've got me. I think he was in the Leamington Hotel in Minneapolis.
And
here in Minneapolis.
What was the election day and results like?
Well, the day, they really thought they had a chance at the end, and then Illinois and Ohio and a couple other states came in at the very end because they were very close and they were ahead for a while. And he basically went to bed believing he probably wasn't going to win, and then in the morning when he woke up, found out he didn't.
Yeah, it's Ohio. It's a very close race. Ohio,
it was close, very close.
Illinois, and then California, which all go to Nixon. And they don't go to Nixon
Jersey.
by a lot. No. Very, very close. And, you know, I think it's just above a percentage point difference in terms of absolute percentage of vote in that national election.
A close popular vote, but the Electoral College vote, as we're showing on the screen, 301 for Richard Nixon, 191. And George Wallace got 46 Electoral College votes. And who did he take them away from?
Well, that's a good argument, but, you know, I think it's, if you think about the fact that the South then was still mostly Democratic and they're reacting to a lot of the civil rights efforts, I think that those votes would have been available for a Democrat who was operating at the behest of the Democratic machine, the union bosses, the mayors, the wealthy in the country. But that was gone. That was gone. That had fallen apart. They were trying to hold together for Humphrey as part of LBJ's machine. But remember, and this is Mick said this earlier, LBJ was not absolutely supportive, didn't let the money go, didn't make the effort to try to give those people a reason to vote for Humphrey. So I think that if I look back on it, my take is that those were Democratic votes. And we haven't talked about African Americans, you know, who are coming into the process. But you know what happens if King lives? Does King get more involved at this point? Does King say that he is for Humphrey? I think he might have. Would King have been someone who might have himself launched a third-party effort? I don't know, but I think that would have changed the dynamic markedly.
What was the African American voter turnout like in 1968? Do you know?
It was pretty good. I don't know the exact numbers, but this is right in the aftermath. And we get the Voting Rights Act in '65, the Civil Rights Act in '64. So this is, you know, kind of a call, a rallying cry for turnout. And so much more in the North and the West than in the South. There's still a lot of intimidation going on. But no, blacks are turning out in numbers.
Can I say the block of states that Wallace got were southern states, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. It's been a question among historians since the end of that election who those votes were taken from. And if you look at it a different way, that if they had a choice of only Nixon or Humphrey, they might have gone to Nixon. You know, so it's hard to know who those votes really came from.
Wallace also took Arkansas and Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Yeah. And let's take a call. Vienna, Virginia is next. This is Jim. Hi, Jim.
Hi there. First of all, I would like to mention that in 1968, in March of 1968, when Johnson made his speech and stepped down, that 2 days before, on Friday, March the 29th, which I have to correct your guess there on that date, March the 29th, Mr. Humphrey agreed to speak at my school, and the speech was scheduled for 3 weeks later. On Sunday, March 31st, is when Johnson made his speech, and I've always wondered since that event whether he had a clue on that Friday, because he scheduled some other speeches for later in April on the same date, that Johnson was going to step down, or he was just simply anticipating that the possibility may exist. Because of that speech, I was able to sit in the front row of his announcement speech on April 27th at the Shoreham Hotel, along with the other students who helped invite him. And I was also at the Capitol the day the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, June the 19th of 1964. So I feel like I've always had a somewhat of a privileged front row seat in parts of his life. Finally, I'd just like to make a comment, which is that most of the progressive legislation and programs that evolved during the 50s, 60s, and 70s were a result of Humphrey's, might say, forward agenda. But it seemed at that point when he ran for president in '68, those key supporters of that legislation turned on him, and he suddenly became outdated or a little bit too conservative, you might say, in their eyes. than what the country was looking for at that time. So the progressives who supported civil rights didn't view him as a strong advocate. The anti-war party did not consider him a strong advocate, and others.
Okay, Jim, I'm going to jump in because I think our guest, Mick, had made that exact point earlier, which is his great influence, but when it came time for his own campaign, he was...
Well, he had his signature in some way or another, his hands on over 1,000 bills in 10 years, one every 3 days, I figured. And the problem in 1968 was there was only one issue, and all the rest was forgotten. It was only Vietnam, and that was it. And all that was lost, unfortunately.
And of course, the fight was, and who had a plan to end the war? Richard Nixon won. The war raged on for another couple of years. What about Hubert Humphrey's life after this?
Well, you know, just to say, Nixon didn't say he was going to end the war. No, what he said was he was going to win the war. And that had...
secret plan he had.
A secret plan.
And that, yeah, but he had secret plans. But I mean, but that was the effort that appealed to that silent majority. So the problem for Humphrey, again, you know, we talked about how he's trapped in terms of being LBJ's vice president and LBJ's feeling that he wants to win this war. But he's also trapped in terms of this larger argument with Nixon, where he wants to say, you know, I'm for stability, I'm not for things going out of control, at the same time that Nixon really says that he's the law and order candidate. Humphrey can never be that, because Nixon has got that space occupied, and even as Humphrey is trying, he's alienating the people who logically would be his supporters.
I want to take a call, and this is for Gavin in Port Jervis, New York. Hello, Gavin.
Hello. You sort of touched upon this earlier, but I guess the question I had was, if George Wallace had been out of the 1968 presidential race, would you have seen the outcome being even closer than it was? And in all of your opinions, who would it have been closer for? Would it have been Humphrey on the top, or would it have put Nixon ahead? Thank you very much.
Okay. You have any more to say on that?
You know, as I said, you know, Mick said he thinks that it's kind of up in the air. I don't know why, but from my perspective, I just think that Wallace hurt Humphrey, and I think that a lot of working class Union folks who had some allegiance to the Democratic Party, I mean, going all the way back to FDR, I think they peeled off and you know, went with Wallace, and I don't know that they would have gone to the Republican Party and to Nixon.
I see that in the North. The South is where I think that if Wallace wasn't in the race in the South, Nixon might have got those votes.
So did Hubert Humphrey give up his presidential aspirations after his defeat in 1968?
Well, he tried. He came close to trying in '72. He started into it, and then he just backed out of to McGovern. He decided not to do it, and he began to be ill at that point too. So I think that had some influence.
But he did go back to the Senate.
In 1970, he took Gene McCarthy's seat in the Senate. Gene McCarthy's popularity in this state had dropped, and he left politics, and Humphrey took it at one of the largest landslides of his senatorial career, and then served there until 1978 when he died.
What was his second stint in the Senate like legislatively?
Second stint?
Yeah, when he returned to the Senate. Was he active legislatively?
He was at the bottom. He was a freshman. He was treated that way. He had no committees. Walter Mondale was a senior senator, and he was treated like someone who was just starting. He was given no respect, but he found his own way. And within a short time, he was passing, you know, working on bills again. And he passed a couple of different major legislation bills during that time. So he got back into it.
Let's take a call from Livonia, Michigan. This is Amy. Hi, Amy. We're talking about Hubert Humphrey. What's your question?
My question is, since Senator Humphrey served during the McCarthy era, what was his relationship with Joe McCarthy? Did McCarthy go after him because he was so liberal?
Well, that's a really complicated question, because Humphrey tried to pass something called the Communist Control Act, where he tried to make it illegal to be communist, and that was done in some part because he was trying to make Joe McCarthy to bring the truth out and force Joe McCarthy's hand. So he would have to prove somebody was a communist, and it would be illegal, and he couldn't be quite so passé about it or blasé about how he attacked people. He would have to actually incriminate them, and that was a bad plan. It didn't work. but he didn't like Joe McCarthy, didn't like any of his tactics, even though he was anti-communist. He didn't like anything about what he did. Thought he was a demagogue.
We have just 2 minutes left. Hubert Humphrey was very ill with cancer. What kind of cancer did he have?
A bladder cancer.
Bladder cancer in the last years of his life in the United States Senate, and he ended up dying in January of 1978. And in the time before he died, he was brought back to the Capitol for what seemed to be an unusual tribute.
Never happened before. It was the first time.
Tell us about that.
Well, it was the first time that both houses of Congress, the Congress and the Senate, met for one senator, to honor one senator. It never happened before. And they all met, and it was just basically just to honor his work. He died 2 months later, and his spirit was still there, and there were Republicans and Democrats on both sides. Paul Simon spoke, Senator Paul Simon.
And he invited Richard Nixon to come back for his funeral in the Capitol building. So
right. He called Nixon at Christmas and said, "You need to come back," and he hadn't been back since Watergate, and he said, "I don't think any president should be not allowed in the city, and I want you to come back." Nixon said, "I don't think I can do it." He said, "You're going to come to my funeral. It's a dying wish," and he showed up at the funeral.
How about
so it was
that?
Nixon back into Washington.
So as we close here, I'm going to ask both of you to bring us full arc. The premise of this series is people that were not successful in their presidential bid, but they changed American history. How did Hubert Humphrey change American history?
That speech at the 48 convention changed America. I mean, you know, you think about the major social movement of the 20th century, it's the civil rights movement. And Hubert Humphrey seems to me to stand at the top of that order in terms of people who held elected office, who put themselves out as advocates, you know, some might say on the right side of history. And he was well ahead of the curve in terms of pushing the Democratic Party, pushing politics in the direction of passage of a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act, and so much of the change that we've seen in this country when it comes to race relations. You know, and similarly, if you think about it just in pure political terms, you think about Barack Obama as President of the United States today, relations. You know, and similarly, if you think about it just in pure political terms, you think about Barack Obama as President of the United States today, that doesn't happen without some of the changes that come as a result of Democratic Party primary process. Again, here's Hubert Humphrey, who comes in. He's the last selection by the party bosses and the machines, and in his aftermath of Hubert Humphrey's defeat in '68, suddenly you have allocation of delegates based on primaries and process. Again, that's part of Hubert Humphrey's legacy. And then there are all of the kind of social programs. We think about the end of the sort of New Deal period, but then you have a whole new range of them, some of them which Mick has been mentioning here, efforts on the social justice scene, but social programs that were the work of Hubert Humphrey's very fertile mind.
Mick, I'm going to apologize to you, but we've run out of time, so what I'm going to do is encourage people to find your documentary, because you make the case about how Hubert Humphrey changed history. This is what it looks like. Hubert H. Humphrey, The Art of the Possible, and it's widely available wherever you buy your videotapes. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Hubert Humphrey was died, as we said, was buried back here in Minneapolis at Lakewood Cemetery. His tombstone has this inscription on it: "I have enjoyed my life, its disappointments outweighed by its pleasures. I have loved my country in a way that some people consider sentimental and out of style. I still do, and I remain an optimist with joy, without apology, about this country and about the American experiment in democracy." That's Hubert Humphrey's gravestone. As we close here on this Contender series, we're going to show you just a bit of video from that very unusual session in the House of Representatives chambers. Some real familiar faces to you old Congress watchers will be here on this clip, when Hubert Humphrey, just months before his death, was invited back for a tribute and a celebration of his long political and legislative career. Thanks for being with us.
Hubert, old friend, we asked you here so we could tell you we love you.
Mr. Speaker, knowing full well the dangers of what I'm about to do, I yield as much time as he wishes to consume to the senior senator from Minnesota.
And I know where I'm standing. I'm standing where the President of the United States gives his State of the Union address. My goodness, how I've longed for that opportunity.
The Contenders features profiles of key figures who've run for president and lost, but changed political history nevertheless. Our live look at the Contenders continues next Friday. We'll be in Montgomery, Alabama to talk with historians and take your calls about the presidential campaign of George Wallace. The series airs live Friday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern through December 9th here on C-SPAN. You can see tonight's program on Hubert Humphrey again at 11 p.m. Eastern. And there's more information online. You can find a schedule of the series, biographies of all the candidates, historians' appraisals, and speeches, all at cspan.org/thecontenders.
There's a story that I was told